They thought it was just an abandoned campsite in the mountains, until the K9 wouldn't stop circling and what was uncovered had been buried for years. Why was it hidden so far from town, and who was planning to come back for it? Here's the full story, but before we get into it, drop your favorite dog's name in the comments and hit that subscribe button. The forest changed past 7,000 feet. The air grew thinner, the birds quieter, pines leaned tighter together, and sunlight filtered down in fractured slices. It was the kind of wilderness where cell signals vanished, where maps turned vague, and where people only went if they had a reason or something to hide. Officer Dane Rowley had both. A call came in 2 days ago from a seasonal ranger stationed at Echo Ridge. A plume of smoke sighted 3 miles from the last marked trail, deep into what was known locally as the no-print zone, land so remote even hunters avoided it. The ranger's drone couldn't get a visual. Winds were too strong, and yet the smoke lingered. It was no forest fire, it was a camp, but not a registered one. That was enough to send Dane and his canine partner Axel into the mountains. Axel was a Dutch shepherd, 6 years old, storm-colored coat mottled in dark streaks. He was part tracker, part detection dog, but above all, a silent sentinel. He didn't bark without purpose. He didn't circle without cause. And that morning, as their department SUV crawled up the rutted service road, Axel was already standing, eyes pinned to the forest line. They reached the last drivable point by noon. Dane strapped on his gear, checked his GPS, then checked it again. No bars. That left just him and the dog, and whatever was hiding beyond the trees. It took 3 hours to reach the ridge where the ranger had spotted the smoke. There was no path, only brush, tight switchbacks, and the occasional claw-marked stone where cougars like to perch. Axel moved like he'd memorized the terrain. Ears forward, nose twitching. Then, just after 3:20 p.m., he stopped. Not abruptly, but slowly, as if something in the wind had changed. He circled once, then again, then 3 more times, tighter each time, nose close to the dirt. Dane froze. "Track," he whispered. Axel dropped low. Not in aggression, in tension. The final circle stopped at a small clearing barely 20 feet wide, where pine needles had been swept aside, revealing flattened earth, recent prints, and 2 items left behind, a spent lighter and a torn zipper tab from a heavy-duty duffel. No tents, no gear, no fire pit, just an invisible presence. And Axel wouldn't move. They stayed there for nearly 20 minutes. Axel paced in circles, not lost, not tracking forward, circling back to the same invisible boundary again and again like a compass caught in a magnetic field. Dane finally decided to break the pattern. He knelt, brushed aside more needles, and found something odd, wood grain, a platform. Buried shallow beneath the soil was a set of planks, old, weathered, but clearly man-made. He dug further with his boot and uncovered part of a steel bracket. This was no temporary fire zone. This had been a constructed camp, but disguised after it was used, which meant one thing: someone didn't want it found. And they had done just enough to erase their trail, but not enough to fool the dog. Axel growled low, then barked, once, toward the slope. Dane grabbed his pack. They descended northeast. 2 ridges over, just before dusk, Dane spotted smoke. Faint, controlled. Axel picked up speed, tail stiff, body aligned in pure pursuit. What they found was a hollowed-out grove surrounded by rock. In the center, a campfire still smoldering, but the tent and supplies had been torched. Not burned accidentally, intentionally. Nearby, wedged between rocks, was a half-melted field stove, and beside it, a plastic document protector scorched but not destroyed. Inside, a fragment of a topographical map marked with a red X, not at their current location, but 5 miles further east, near the old rock quarry that had been closed since 7. Axel sniffed the ground, then paced toward a set of brush that had been recently trampled, fresh enough that soil was still wet beneath the surface. They weren't far behind whoever had camped here, and whoever they were trying to vanish. That night, Dane radioed back through a satellite relay. His message: unregistered camp found, trail leads east, map fragment recovered, But before he could even receive a full reply, another message buzzed in through the dispatch relay. Missing persons, Ridge County. Name, Dean Ellison, age 39. Last seen 4 days ago. Occupation, logistics driver. Reported by Sister Megan Ellison. Known behavior, solo hikes, off-grid trips. No official vehicle travel logged since Thursday. Dane stared at the alert. Ridge County was 20 miles north of their current zone, but the quarry, that was the only eastbound connection between both. He pulled out the half-burned map again. The X, right on the border, right at the edge of a possible escape route. Dane looked at Axel. The dog stared back, calm but wired. Tomorrow, Dane whispered, we finish this trail. But the mountain had its own plans, because someone else was already watching. From less than 200 yards away, just past the crest, behind a veil of leaves, waiting to see if the dog would keep circling or if the next step would be one too far. The morning came late in the mountains. Even by 8 a.m., mist still clung to the ridge like it was afraid to let go. Officer Dane Rowley had barely slept. The forest had been too still. Even the birds were quiet. Beside him, Axel had stayed motionless most of the night, curled but alert, nose pointed toward the direction of the quarry marked on the half-burned map. The deeper they went, the stranger everything felt. This was not just a missing persons case. This was a path that someone had tried to erase, but the dog wouldn't let it go. By 9:15 a.m., they were on the move. Axel picked up the scent again near the eastern slope, a section of the terrain littered with broken branches and churned earth, like something had been dragged. Not animal. The pattern was linear, human, possibly heavy. Every few yards, Dane spotted subtle signs, an old boot imprint, a snapped fern, a scuff mark on a stone. None were fresh, but none were more than a week old either. It was near 11:30 a.m. when they reached the outer edge of the quarry. A faded sign still hung, rusted, from a bent metal pole, Ridgework Mining Corporation. Access closed, entry unauthorized. Beyond it, gravel turned to dust, and old tire ruts ran along the slope like scars. Axel froze. He didn't bark. Instead, he crouched, tail stiff, head low. Then he looked up, not at the road, at the rock wall. A vertical bluff that led nowhere, unless you knew what to look for. Dane followed Axel's gaze. There, behind a veil of moss and creeping vines, something glinted. Metal, bolted, a hatch. It took 30 minutes to clear the growth. When Dane pulled the last root aside, the full hatch revealed itself. Steel, weatherproofed with no identifying marks, no lock, just a sliding bolt and a rubber-sealed grip. Dane hesitated, glanced at Axel. The dog didn't move, no bark, but the stare was unwavering. This was it. Dane opened the hatch. Inside was a narrow stone stairwell, descending at a sharp angle. Lightless, silent, and colder than the air outside. He pulled out a flashlight and stepped down. Each step echoed like it was landing on something more than rock. At the base, the tunnel widened into what looked like a supply chamber. Rebar beams, corrugated walls, and shelves. 3 rows of them, stocked, with gear, climbing tools, fuel tablets, maps, batteries, ration packs labeled with European distributor codes. But that wasn't what made Dane stop cold. It was the clothing, 5 identical jackets, black, no logos. But sewn on the inside collar, stitched in red, were 4 initials, CITO. He didn't recognize them, but he took a photo. And as he turned, Axel let out a short, abrupt bark from the top of the stairwell. A warning. Dane shut off the light and pressed against the wall. He could hear it. Footsteps. Soft. Intentional. And they weren't his. A figure crossed the tunnel mouth, hooded, carrying a rucksack. Dane bolted forward. Police. Stop. The man turned, but only for a second, then ran. Through the tunnel, deeper into an auxiliary shaft long thought collapsed, but it wasn't. It opened into another chamber, and in that chamber, a map painted across the wall. Crude but clear. It connected 5 locations, all wilderness zones. One was Echo Ridge, another was near Ridge County, and the final one, unmarked. Dane didn't have time to memorize it, because the runner had gone straight into a side crawl low just barely wide enough for a man, too tight to chase. He disappeared into the dark, gone, again. After the chase, Dane scoured the chamber. In one corner, behind a broken panel, he found a metal case. Inside, printed documents, a ledger of names and code names, and one photo clipped to the top of the stack. A man, roughly 40, black beard, gray eyes. He wasn't labeled, but Dane recognized the face, Dean Ellison, the missing logistics driver. But the photo had been taken in front of a cabin, not a forest, not a road, a log structure, with a number burned into the doorframe, 73. There were no numbered structures in Ridge County, unless it was on one of the old fire roads. Those weren't mapped anymore, but there had once been a fire station way back, abandoned after funding cuts. Dane opened the logbook. Page after page listed drop dates, codes, and one entry stood out. Transfer to number 73 complete. Subsoil verified. Ops next phase dependent on delivery from Bunker South. That was the final line. Underneath it a stamp, same 4 letters, CITO. That night, back at base camp, Dane uploaded the image to a federal inquiry database. He waited. 30 minutes later, a reply came through. CITO stood for Covert Infrastructure Transport Operations. It wasn't official, it was flagged, not as an agency, as an alias. Used in 4 prior investigations tied to underground logistics, black market weapons transport, and 2 unsolved border incidents. But no arrests were ever made. All suspects vanished before capture, like ghosts, until now. And it was a dog who brought them out. Axel stood silently beside the fire, head low, tail unmoving, like he knew there was more. Because there was, and it was buried beneath more than just soil. By sunrise, Officer Dane Rowley had already circled half the ridge. Axel trotted beside him, tireless. It had been 2 days since the hidden camp was uncovered, and 29 hours since the man in the hood vanished into the crawl space. And yet they were no closer to understanding the why. The federal reply about CITO confirmed the worst. It wasn't a local problem. It was part of a hidden logistics chain, which meant whatever had been buried back in the mountains beneath that forgotten camp was likely not meant to stay there. It was waiting to be moved, or worse, activated. Dane returned to the station to cross-reference the wall map he had photographed inside the underground chamber. He laid it against a current terrain map. Something was off. The dots didn't line up with regular trails. They followed elevation patterns, not travel routes. That meant only one thing: airdrop or satellite relay points. A strategy used in off-grid covert systems. If anything went wrong on the ground, the sites could relay data or packages from one node to the next without ever crossing public systems. That would explain the buried signal nodes and odd wiring. And it made something else clear. They had only found one of the cache sites. There were at least 3 more marked on the crude wall map. One of them was already circled. It was nowhere near the first bunker. It was back down the mountain, just 10 miles from town, on a hilltop known locally as Camber's Bluff, a scenic overlook, a place hikers pass daily, and a perfect place to hide in plain sight. At 2:10 p.m., Dane and Axel reached the gravel trailhead that led to Camber's Bluff. It was peaceful, quiet. 2 tourists were walking down, sipping iced drinks. No one suspected anything, but Axel? Axel stopped cold halfway up the path. He didn't bark. He whined, soft, low, from deep in his throat. Dane knew that sound. It wasn't fear. It was uncertainty, alert but unsure. They followed the trail until it opened into a wide, flat ridge lined with old stone benches and faded trail signs. Axel veered right, into the brush. He stopped near an old water tank, half concealed by wild thorn bush. Then he sat, still, focused. That was his strongest alert. Again, Dane pulled out his field kit. Behind the tank, buried beneath a layer of broken stone, was a wooden frame, carefully camouflaged, a hatch, just like the first. They pried it open slowly. No alarms, no sound. Inside was a small drop chamber, less than 8 feet square, dry, cold, and inside 2 crates, one sealed, one already open. The open crate held something that stopped Dane in his tracks. Uniforms, black jackets with CITO tags. But not just jackets, patches. Government department patches, custom-sewn overlays to mimic federal agents, forest rangers, even Homeland Security. Disguises, tools for infiltration. The second crate was still sealed, heavy, bolted with a triple lock case. Dane called for explosives disposal protocol. When the squad arrived and cut it open, they found 2 things: a hard-plated drive shielded in lead-lined casing, a communications relay unit capable of broadcast jamming up to 12 miles. But what mattered most, the relay was on a timer, set for 9 a.m. the following day. Its coordinates? Lancaster Valley, exactly where Dane had been first dispatched 5 days earlier. This wasn't just storage, it was deployment staging. Back at HQ, the lead line drive was handed to federal techs. It took hours, but what they found confirmed everything. The files detailed a cascading blackout protocol, labeled Project Shroud. The goal? To isolate a region through signal jamming, fake emergency alerts, and impersonated law enforcement response. The result? Complete control of communication, movement, and panic, long enough for a transfer or extraction to take place. But what they couldn't tell was what they wanted to extract, or from where. The file listed only one term under primary payload: R code entity, Ridge origin confirmed. What that meant no one knew, but Dane had a hunch, and Axel was already pacing again. There was one site left unsearched, the farthest node on the underground map, positioned along an abandoned watchtower at the top of Echo Ridge, a place locals rarely visited. The trail was washed out, the forest overgrown. But Axel led them there anyway, by foot, hour by hour, until they found it. The tower was collapsed, but the cellar remained. Inside, buried in reinforced crates, were encrypted records, dozens of them, documenting black site operations under false agency names. But the final folder said something else. It was printed, not typed, labeled with 4 initials, for CITO, Field Operative, Handler, H271 Axel. They froze. It was not addressed to Dane, it was addressed to the dog. Inside the folder, a microchip trace, one that matched Axel's ID code. It had been copied, tracked, replicated. Whoever had designed CITO had been using working K9 units as live disruption sensors, and at some point they began cloning their ID patterns to test alert systems. Axel hadn't just found them. He was part of the counter-sequence they were trying to erase. The last page of the file was just a warning. Any unit triggering 3 consecutive field disruptions must be isolated. Do not allow 4th alert. Phase collapse risk 78%. Axel had already triggered 4. That's why Caleb Shore had been placed in town. Why Halden had tried to wipe the evidence. Because one dog's instincts were unraveling everything. And when the 4th alert came, the entire network began to collapse. CITO's infrastructure was dismantled over the next month. Multiple ghost facilities were found across neighboring states. No central leaders, just nodes. But each time they searched, it was a K9 alert that pointed the way. Axel remained on duty for 2 more years, then retired with honors. But in the agency files, he was listed under a new classification: Biological Disruption Vector, Category X. Dane never called him that. To him, Axel was never a tool. He was the reason the town was still standing, the reason the plans failed, the reason they were found. Because when every system was silent, it was the bark that made the difference. If that twist caught you off guard, trust me, what's coming next will hit even harder. So make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on. Drop a comment with your favorite K9 moment from this story, and don't blink, because the next one's just around the corner.